The panel is called Developing Ourselves as Leaders for Tough Times. Now, you will notice that one of the people up on the panel is not Iris Chen yet. It is Luana Lewis, our Senior VP of Programs. Iris Chen is moderating this panel. She is almost here. She is stuck in traffic. So she will be here in just a few moments. Luana has been on every single call and has obviously been an integral part of developing the program. So as soon as Iris shows up, which I expect to be in just a few moments, we will have, along the lines of our theme, a transition of leadership. So as soon as Iris shows up, we will have her come on the panel. But with that, I'm going to just ask Luana to introduce the panel and start the conversation. And as soon as Iris is here, she will jump in.
Welcome, everyone. And I'm excited to be able to introduce a fabulous group of leaders. I can't wait to hear what they have to say. On my left is Richard Buery, who is President and CEO of the Children's Aid Society. He has previously founded, I believe, 2 nonprofits, Groundwork and iMentor. Is that right, Richard? And has a very interesting career path to leadership to tell us about. Then to his left, Scott Millstein is the Executive Director of the Coro New York Leadership Center, which trains leaders. And I believe that's both nonprofit and corporate leaders. Is that right?
That's right, and
yes.
Government.
And then to his left, Janice Nittoli, the Associate Vice President and Managing Director of the Rockefeller Foundation, who has held a wide variety of leadership positions and is obviously a major leader at a major foundation. I'd like to kick off the proceedings by asking each of our panelists to talk about their own paths to leadership. And Janice, how about starting with you?
Sure. Thanks, Luana. Thanks, everybody, for including me this morning, and congratulations on the work that you're doing. I'm from Queens. I am usually so loud, I never need a microphone. I think I'll take my couple of minutes and sort of start with what I guess is sort of a half-baked headline for me personally, and then unwind in a few sentences from there. And that's to say, I think it took me a long time, probably longer than it should have, to realize that career paths are sort of an expression of self-knowledge, and that we spend a lot of time sort of thinking, gee, am I going to, in our careers, is this employer going to pick me? Am I going to get this job? And it took me a long time to sort of figure out that actually the job doesn't pick you, but you sort of pick the job, in the sense that you learn sort of what makes you sing, and you sort of learn to recognize it in opportunities or organizations or roles. And in any relationship in our lives, as we know, you never have everything on the list, and you sort of learn how you can balance that. I didn't get that. I was sort of in the, figure something out. And I think I started out as a young professional trying to be very planful, and didn't sort of realize that sometimes the accidents were sort of more telling than the plans. So I worked my way through college. I was a philosophy major, so that sort of taught you how to write well. So I used to get hired to write, and I thought I wanted to change the world by working in a think tank. Got a job in a think tank and was horrified that people read books during the day, because I thought that stuff you did on the subway or at night, but like you got paid to read a book, was a little too weird for me. So I guess I majored in philosophy, not psychology, so I use this term not as a professional. Perhaps I overcompensated. I went into local government in New York City in the middle 1980s in service delivery, and I sort of fell in love with the immediacy of it. I was in essence an unsupervised adult because other people were busy. It was a crazy time. I worked in social services. Commissioner Krauskopf is with us. I learned a lot from him. It was the beginning of the crack epidemic in New York City. And your sandbox was as big as you wanted it to be. If you were intentional and tried to execute with diligence and said, I'll go figure that out, you were allowed to go figure it out. It was an amazing, incredible ride. Could have been sort of a breach of public trust to sort of entrust so much to these children, but I had a great time and learned a lot. And I started to sort of learn that it wasn't like I wanted to grow up and be a baby commissioner, but I wanted to sort of make a difference for a groups of people, particularly disadvantaged kids and families, who just have the odds stacked against them for no reason of their own. And that government is an important lever for that, but it wasn't the only one. And so after about 10 years, I went into a not-for-profit, and actually tried very hard to get off after a couple of years the grant treadmill, which we all fantasize about, and ended up working for this nonprofit where I actually ended up copywriting some of the materials that they did. We opened a fulfillment house. I had my own 800 number. I felt like J. Crew. And people sort of ordered my stuff, and I sort of, got on the list. Even though I didn't sell textbooks, I got on the list to be an alternative to a textbook, and realized we had an educational publishing business, and realized that I could barely stay awake in conversations about educational publishing, that I had no expertise about it, I don't know anything about it, and so started to sort of scratch my head to think about what to do next. I have been in philanthropy for a while, but I met it by accident. I agreed to sort of help manage the transition for a new president to the nonprofit where I was working, and met foundations by shaking them down for money, and talked to one for like a year and a half, and they were very, very nice, and they couldn't quite say no to me, and I knew I wasn't really getting anywhere, but I figured, they're nice, and you sort of get out of the office, and they have a nice office, and you get to talk to them. And so I did that for a year and a half, or close to 2 years, and at some point they offered me a job, and that's how I got into foundations. Completely true. And so, but what I have learned as I continue to age is that it's still very important to sort of, so just remember like why you put your socks on in the morning, and it's not about a job, but it's like roles that you get to do. And I am incredibly lucky to have a very rich and active civic life, and things that I do that are, I think I bring back into the office when I go there, but it's not sort of directly related to what my work is every day at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I hope I get to sort of practice some of the things that Vic advised me and some of our other colleagues in the community as we go forward. So that's sort of in a nutshell how I've sort of bumbled around.
Great. Scott, how about you?
Well, I started my career in public service as an eager, young, ambitious staff analyst, and sort of got as much out of that job as I could, and was very fortunate that I got noticed by a senior executive, and he provided me an opportunity. And that was really so critical, I think, in my own path of leadership, was that someone seasoned gave me opportunity. It wasn't just an opportunity in terms of a position and a title of leadership, that's important, but also an opportunity to work on my own, and an opportunity to fail. And the confidence, particularly for me being a young leader of that space, knowing that I had that support, was, I think, really critical for my own personal development. The other thing that I think that was really helpful was the position, my first senior leadership position was actually the position of chief of staff. And it's a unique position in an organization that has a lot of responsibility, but no direct line authority. And the skills that I had to develop to do that job effectively, to lead change in an organization when you don't have the supervisor relationships, is a really, really, I've come to believe, a critical leadership skill. And the opportunities to practice in that environment with that both responsibility and also those constraints, I think was a really, really helpful development tool, and one that I think I still to this day carry and think about providing those opportunities in that space, that idea of leadership without authority, and how powerful that can be to build the leadership capacity for lots of my work.
Great. Rich, how about you?
Good morning. So I think the key advice I would have reflecting on my career is to be lucky. So if you could work on that, it would be very helpful. I think I was really lucky in that I sort of figured out what I wanted to do in college. And I think two important themes from my career have been the importance of maintaining good relationships and the importance of taking chances, perhaps even silly chances. So, when I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn. And like a lot of folks who grew up where I grew up in Brooklyn, particularly when I went to high school and had new experiences and met people from different neighborhoods of the city, I sort of had my first real socialization of the differences between life for children in wealthier parts of the city and low-income parts of the city, growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, and going to school at Stuyvesant, and sort of had this very sort of jarring experience of experiencing the way life is lived in different parts of the city. And so the question, I think for a lot of kids who have that experience, you can be angry, you can be disconnected, you can be all sorts of things, but I had a really lucky experience in college, again, just based on relationship, that a friend of mine who I went to high school with invited me to volunteer with her in an after-school program in a housing project in Boston. And so I started volunteering 1 day a week, and then I was volunteering 2 or 3 days a week, and next thing you know, I was there more than I was on campus. And one thing about this after-school program, we were having a great time, although we didn't really know what we were doing. We would help the kids with their homework, we'd read books with them, but there was no summer program. So we had the idea, as 17 or 18-year-old to do, well, let's start a summer program for the kids. And so I think on the one hand, I had the great experience of trying something and creating something early before I was smart enough to realize that it was crazy to start things, to try to start new things. But we had a very successful experience. We raised money, we hired staff, we built community relationships, and we started a summer camp for kids in this housing project in Roxbury that continues today. So I sort of had this great experience early on that when faced with a sense of injustice and when possessed of a lot of energy, that you can do something to react to the problems we see. And so most of my really career has been around helping and being a part of creating new institutions to achieve social justice. But also relationships have played an important part. Now, I went to law school, no really good reason except that it was like most of people do, I guess, when you're in college and don't have a clear path to go to law school. And then I practiced law because that's sort of the thing you do after you graduate. So I was working as a civil rights lawyer, which is a perfectly great thing to do, but just wasn't me. I wasn't enjoying it. We were working on very interesting cases, but working with some community rights groups in Louisiana, but just always felt that the people we were working with had much more interesting jobs than I did. It didn't feel very creative, it very reactive. So again, relationships come into play. A friend of a friend who I went to law school with had a brother who worked for a guy who wanted to start a nonprofit connecting young people with volunteers through the internet, which seemed like a really crazy idea to me, but it was a chance to start something. And so because this friend is the friend of the brother, or rather the brother's friend's friend, knew that I was interested in nonprofits and knew that, as I was in college, I had started a nonprofit. Apparently he had a very small nonprofit circle, but he introduced us and we started iMentor, which has now grown into a very successful nonprofit using the internet and using technology to connect people with volunteers. And while we were doing this, I had another brilliant idea based on experiences I had had and youth development experiences of going back home to East New York where I grew up and starting an organization that would more directly support young people and families where I grew up. And very critical to that, all the relationships that I had built in starting iMentor, including the hedge fund manager who was the boss of my friend's friend, provided the seed funding to start that organization, Groundwork, which I ran for 7 years before getting a call from a search firm about joining the Children's Aid Society. So, I think for me, all of these experiences, I think the core theme of all these experiences is taking a lot of chances, and sometimes chances that didn't make a lot of sense. When we were starting Groundwork, it was shortly after 9/11. It was a recession, although it seems quaint to use that word compared to where we are now, but it seemed like a recession at the time. And certainly, in starting a nonprofit, everyone said, it would be crazy to start a nonprofit that wasn't directly related to supporting the victims of 9/11. But we did it, and we're very proud of what we built. And again, in joining the Children's Aid Society, a very different type of organization. An organization, unlike my previous experiences where we were starting things from scratch, a place that has been around for a few years. But again, I think my earlier experiences, I think gave me some of the bravery to try something new and to try something different. So I would focus again, I think, on luck, being in the right place at the right time, relationships, networking, being clear about what I wanted to be, recruiting mentors, talking to people, and building relationships have been critical to my career. And again, just taking big chances.
Thank you. Rich, I'd like to continue with you for just a moment and build on something that Vic DeLuca was saying in his keynote remarks. We're facing an extraordinary time full of challenges for both foundation leaders and nonprofit leaders. Thinking about where you've been and where you're going now with your own organization, what are the leadership challenges you're facing now? What are the things that you're learning as you move along? And how can that help the people who are in the audience here today?
Leadership challenges are many. I think obviously the central challenge that everyone faces is, I think our moderator just joined us.
Iris Chen has just joined us. She's our moderator from the I Have a Dream Foundation. Here's where we are. Awesome, thanks. Talking about leadership challenges.
Hi, Iris. How are you? So I'll continue answering the question. I think the central leadership challenge that we face right now is tied, as for most of us are, tied to the economy. We're in a position where we have seen declining revenue, as most of us had, declines in our endowment, an extremely volatile funding environment, which creates anxiety for staff. It requires us to make lots of changes quickly. And I think much of my leadership is around how do we take this vulnerable organization with a rich track record, a rich history of serving the most vulnerable populations, and lead it during a very, very difficult time. Now, that would be challenging at all times, but it's particularly challenging with new leadership because in many cases, I'm trying to make decisions, trying to set a proper course with limited information because I haven't been there for a long time, and also with limited relationships because it's not a leader that people have known for a long time who they can trust because we've been through challenges together. So we're starting with a very big challenge, and they're getting to know me through this very big challenge. So, I think our leadership challenges are all wrapped up in my newness and in the very critical challenge facing us. So I think a few things that I would say that I've tried to stay with. Although I'm new, one value that I've tried to keep with is to try to stick with the things that have gotten me so far. There's some things that I believe in that are important to leading an institution: clarity of mission, clarity of goals, being very clear about where our challenges are and what we're going to do. And although I don't necessarily have the track record or the history with everyone to have a long record of trust, I'm still just moving forward with what I think is right. And I think that's been a central part of how I move through this process. The second is I've always been lucky in my career to have worked with great people, and have thought that one of my talents is bringing together strong teams. At the Children's Aid Society, it's not a team that I've brought together, but it is a remarkable group of people. And so I think a central part of my leadership path as we go through this transition is to have trust and faith in the people around me. I think for a new leader, there can be a tendency to want to show off and impress everyone. I've got a new plan. I know how we're doing this. I know the way to go forward. But for me, I think it has been critical to spend less time talking and trying to lead and more time listening and relying on the wisdom and the strength of the people around me. I think another pitfall you can go into a position like this, it's very easy coming into a large organization to focus on the thing that you know and to want to go in and micromanage the people who run the program that you have some experience in, and I think to ignore the people who run things that are complex, that I don't really understand, and don't necessarily want to show that I don't know what I'm doing by trying to get involved. So I think another leadership discipline for me has been not overemphasizing the things where I'm more comfortable and underemphasizing the things where I'm least comfortable, but to really try to recognize that my role as a manager is to support all those people, to listen to all those people, and to try to set a course for bringing all those people together.
Sorry, are you the first to answer that
I
question?
was the first to answer that
Okay,
question.
so we're going to go left. I guess, Scott, do you want to go?
Yeah, I would add 2 points to that about sort of leadership challenges at this time. One is the balance between the strategic vision, long-term vision, and the immediacy of the short-term, day-to-day operations. And balancing that as a leader in an organization, I think, is really one of the critical skills that all of us in any capacity really need to think about. I can't emphasize enough, and I'm sure you know this from your own experience, how important it is to stay connected with the long-term vision of the organization. I'm really fortunate in that our organization just completed a strategic planning process just a few months ago. And, some people said to me, you're crazy to do a strategic planning process. You should be focusing on how you're going to get through the next 6 months, not the next 6 years. And I completely disagree with that. Because not only does the exercise, and it doesn't have to be a formal planning process, but the mindfulness of a longer term vision, not only is it so critical to lead an organization to have that longer term vision beyond just the next few months, beyond just the sustainability questions as a tool, but it's a very, very powerful a concept for all of your organization stakeholders. It's a very challenging time, and we don't need to sort of go through the litany of challenges. You all know it, but it's a really challenging time for all of the stakeholders in your organization, their staff, your clients, your board members, your funders. A vision is a really, really powerful tool, and I would, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I would, that's one of the things that I've been really trying to stay true at. I keep a copy of our strategic plan right on my desk as a reference to kind of, remind me about what this is all about, and stay close to that. The second point I would say is really about the challenges is to remain mindful of leadership, because our responsibilities at this time, we have a lot of things to do. We have fewer resources to do them. There's a lot of things we need to do to manage through these times. And that's a different skill set and a different set of tasks than leading through these times. Cutting budgets, there's a story, Tom Friedman's column over the weekend was actually about kind of the new phase of leadership. And he had written about, well, the job of leaders today is to cut budgets and cut staff and figure out how to do more with less. Those I think are not leadership tasks. Those are the management tasks that we all have to face with working in this environment. The leadership tasks is how do we communicate that? How do we engage others, staff, stakeholders to think about doing things differently? How do we make sure we're focusing on what's core? The decisions that have to get made around the environment that we're in, those are things that all of us are capable of, and we can sit in our desks and think about doing. Be mindful of everything else that happens outside and the implication of those decisions, how we become those decisions, because that is, I think, going to be a much more important barometer of success rather than whether you cut X amount from the budget or not.
Thank you, Scott. Janice?
Thanks, Iris. Thanks. I couldn't agree more with Scott and Rich's point as well about the importance of knowing who you are. So I'll sort of make a point about that, and one other quick point that echoes something Vic said earlier. I think it's very important to sort of hold tightly, as Scott said, your identity, and I would suggest to be a little bit more loose than perhaps we have been in the past about how you get there. So a couple of just quick examples. In my civic life, I have spent many years sort of working with a youth-serving organization that got increasingly frustrated how they would spend the after-school hours with their young people and were sort of, heartbroken by how they were treated during the day in their schools. And is, trying to figure out how to open a school. This is a group of people who know a lot about fostering the healthy development of young people, but not a whole lot about how to run a school. But, are intelligent and know how to talk to people and are willing to learn. And, 5 years ago I would have said, what are you talking about? A dance company I work with was looking for a way to sort of find a place where they could sort of try out works in progress in front of an audience, which is, in the city is very hard to do because everything involving real estate and city is hard to do. Collaborated with a settlement house. You sort of let us sort of work in your auditorium. We'll get people in your neighborhood, in your space. We'll, offer a chance to put an art sort of spin on some of your programming. So literacy becomes a poetry reading. A senior center becomes Off Our Rockers. There's hip hop dancing in the after school programs. And so the dance company actually can raise money from people investing in community development and neighborhood building, and the settlement house can sort of go for arts funding that they weren't able to in the past. These dancers are not, these dancers wouldn't sort of first self-identify as community developers, but of course they certainly are. And the settlement house administrators, if you know them, you would know that they are not dancers. But that works. Another thing, we know that the Juvenile Justice Agency and the Child Welfare Agency in New York City are merging. They recognize that one is what we've tried in juvenile justice largely hasn't worked, and secondly, the populations are basically the same. That suggests perhaps not more money, but a reallocation of money. So an investment in youth services that perhaps hasn't been there before. One last sort of note about this is we've heard a lot about the stimulus spending and debates about the extent to which it sort of has made the recession less awful than it would have been, which I sort of agree with. But only about a third of that money has been spent. So there's 2/3 more that's coming through. And the first tranches did go, as Vic said, sort of directly to government. It was teachers and cops who weren't going to get laid off. But that is not sort of what it takes, the rusty gears of government sort of take a while for that stuff to sort of come through. And there will be, the next tranches of funding are sort of more targeted to nonprofits. Last thing I'll just sort of say, so if that's about the sort of being tight about your vision and sort of loose about how you get there and sort of open to opportunities that you might have originally sort of said, that's not me, that's not what we do. The other thing is something Vic said earlier, which is I think you cannot underestimate the importance of having data to back up your assertions of impact. You just can't say, it's a children's aid thing you don't understand. It's like, it doesn't work that way. You need to have sort of the data to articulate and document that. So that's my advice.
Thank you all. I want to apologize for being late. I'm so happy to be here today. I love talking about this topic, and I actually think of leadership. And I personally think that there's never been a more exciting time for leadership to step up, and that there are numerous opportunities to drive change across all the different sectors that we care about, whether it be education, healthcare, economic equity. But it's going to rely on all of us really stepping up and taking advantage of it. So I would like, a lot of you have talked about how difficult the time is and how it's requiring change, and the need to stay true to who you are. And then at the same time, you're talking about the future and strategic planning. Richard, I'd like to start with you because I know you're coming on board as a new leader and beginning to think about how you want to shape the organization moving forward. How do you think about growing organizational impact? How do you go about really figuring out, what is the impact we can have, what's the impact we're currently having, and how do we get from one to the next?
Well, I would actually just follow up on what Janice said. At the Children's Aid Society, as I described before, we're a very complex agency. Over 100 programs at 45 sites, running the gamut of types of interventions, from early childhood programming to foster care services to juvenile justice programming. Sure. Is that better? Put the mic up. So I think at Children's Aid Society is a very complex organization. We do lots of different works in lots of different sectors. Within the organization, because we are so complex, different divisions, different part of the organizations are in different places in terms of how they define their impact, how they measure their impact, and how strong or clear the proof of that impact is. One of the key initiatives I'd like to move forward at Children's Aid, and it speaks very much to what Janice said, is to really begin an organization-wide process of defining what our overall goals are. What do we want to happen for 12-year-old boys? What do we want to happen for 6-year-old girls? Regardless of where they are in the organization. And use that process to begin to force our various divisions to think of their goals separately, to align themselves to those goals, and then to invest in the processes and the system that it takes to really measure impact, to measure our effectiveness against those goals. I think the benefits of that kind of process are numerous. It helps with fundraising, obviously. It helps with marketing. It helps get the word out about our impact. But it also helps bring the organization together. It helps to make sure that we are not many organizations, but one organization moving toward the same goal. The challenge, of course, and maybe I think it also speaks to what Scott is saying, is that the process of doing that takes time and it takes resources. And in a time when we are facing budget cuts, facing declining revenue, the challenge from staff, the challenge from board, the challenge from constituents can be, well, why would you invest in systems? Why would you invest in things that don't directly connect to a child being served, while at the same time we are pulling back from service in other places? And I think this gets to the point of why it's important to communicate well, but also to be true to what you think matters. I think the difficult communication for our team has been and will continue to be that the difficult decisions that we make now, including, in many cases, taking money from direct service to invest in infrastructure, will pay off in the long term, not just for our agency, but will pay off in the long term for our ability to serve more children more effectively over time, particularly as we're in this strange time where there are actually incredible new opportunities. Janice was talking about the combination, the merger of DJJ into ACS here in the city will create tremendous opportunities to create new ways of working and supporting with young people at risk. The various funds in the federal government, whether it's the social innovation funds, and create incredible new opportunities to serve children. And I think unless organizations like us really invest in these systems, the ability to innovate intentionally to demonstrate impact, we simply won't be well positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. So, I think for me that's really central to the challenge. It would be difficult at any time. Not a lot of people want to spend money on these things. It's not as cute as spending money on a child coming to a program or receiving a service. But it's particularly challenging in a time when we're already cutting back on services. But that's going to be our central challenge and where I want to move forward.
I think another, so you talked a lot about sort of innovation, and I'd be curious to hear from either Janice or Scott. The whole idea of, the world is moving even more quickly than it ever has before, and perhaps more of us, more organizations, just like the private sector, need to begin to think about baking innovation in and agility into our model so that while we want to stay true to who we are, as we've talked about, we also can identify and capitalize on new opportunities in real time. So how have you all been able, I guess, Janice, you've done both, it sounds like the operating side, but also the funding side. I'd be curious to see if you've seen any best practices of sort of innovation baked in, where some organizations are better than others at responding to new opportunities without losing sight of their mission. And Scott, I know you've also talked about you're in the middle of a strategic planning process. Coro, I think, has spun off quite a number of different programs even before your time, and it sounds like you're coming on board with even bigger plans to do more of that. So either of you, if you want to get us started on that question.
Yeah, I would say that one thing about this environment is when all of us think about impact and growth, I think it's a different model. Historically, I think the default model of growth and impact was more programs, more services, more clients, more. And I'm not sure, even when resources weren't as constrained, that was always the best way to achieve impact. One of the things that certainly I'll speak on behalf of my organization, and we have been thinking about our growth and our impact. It's the current environment has forced us to be much more critical than perhaps maybe we would have in a different resource environment. So I think that's not a bad thing, and about really being sure about what's core. And the more clear you are about what's core and the more clear you are about your expertise and your impact and focused you are, I think that is a real important prerequisite to innovation and growth. I'll just sort of give you an example from Coro. We've really, as a result of our planning process, felt like our growth and our impact is what we do with our alumni community, that after 30 years, there's almost 2,000 Coro alumni in the city in all sorts of positions in government, nonprofit, and business. And it's not just deputy mayors and commissioners, but it's activists and entrepreneurs. And we've said, okay, our impact is in our alumni community. And so to get more impact out of an organization, it's not just to start another program or hire more staff. It's actually to use our existing staff to do more ways that we can support and connect and sustain our alumni community. So that's a way that's a sort of a path of growth and impact that, just speaking from a personal example, that we've really embraced, that bases on our existing resources, but came about, and I think will have a greater impact, but came about because we were thinking and forced to think really critically about what is core and what our real impact is.
I find that actually very helpful, because you want to, it's important, you want to own the impact. You don't necessarily have to own the program. So because you have an idea about how to sort of build a better mousetrap, sometimes I feel like innovation sort of gets, becomes this mysterious thing when I think it's sort of basically about building a better mousetrap. You can have an idea about how to do that. It just because you do, it doesn't mean that you then have to live with it and own it forever, which can then sort of induce sort of managerial freak out, like how can I sort of sustain this thing? So there are institutions like, Coro, for example, that sort of extends its impact through its alumni network. You don't sort of own you don't sort of have the intellectual property rights on what your alumni do, but you clearly sort of see it as an extension of your impact. There are other Buery Institute comes to mind as an organization that sort of routinely sort of spins off programs. They get an idea about how to sort of produce better results for people. They may get it started, but then they sort of see how it can sort of live on its own. The other piece of that is also sort of walking away from things that don't work. Rich, you sort of spoke about that a little bit. Just because you did something well for a long time doesn't mean that you need to sort of continue it, because again, you don't own the program, you sort of own the impact, and maybe there's some reinvestment of some funds in one area that should go into another. Just today, not to sort of make light of that, having sort of just recently been through in my civic life with an organization that was letting go of its camp, which was, a upstate camp, settlement house, obviously long-term emotional, not to mention property attachments, but it's an important, I think, process to consider.
I guess bring this,
Just one more point I wanted to make about this point about innovation. I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation that exists within our own organizations, and we don't always recognize it. There's a Coro alum who runs an organization in the city called Echoing Green, which is a fellowship program for social entrepreneurs, and they have 14 fellowships a year, and this past year she told me they got over 1,000 applications for 14 fellowships. And my takeaway from that is, what is going on in the 986 organizations that these people applied from that they felt like they could not innovate within their own organizations? That's real potential. And I think that if we look within, particularly at this moment, and provide those opportunities, I think that's a real rich source of innovation.
So bring that to a technical level. So it sounds like a lot of organizations haven't figured out yet how do we enable innovation and strategic shifts, et cetera, within our organization. How do you tangibly and practically build in that competency? Do you have a chief innovation officer? Do you go through regular sort of revisiting, your organization, what they're doing as part of the planning? I mean, how are you all handling that? Or how do you plan to, I guess, in your relatively new roles?
Well, just say very briefly, I wish we had a chief innovation officer. I think I'm very lucky that I'm at an organization that truly does have a very rich history of innovation. So I think to some extent, the idea of creating new solutions to old problems, as well as building on past successes, is very much a part of our DNA. So it doesn't happen because we have an institutional matrix for it, but we celebrate it as part of our history. And I think by celebrating it as part of our history, by showing at a leadership level that we're open to new ideas, that we encourage people to move forward, I think a lot of it is about repeating these stories about the things we've created, the things we're creating, and I think that lets people know that this is a place where you can create. I would just follow up with the thing that Janice said, that the challenge right now is, where do you find the resources to innovate? Where do you find the resources to create? And part of that comes from being disciplined about saying that the resources to create have to come from things that maybe we've created in the past that no longer work, or that someone is doing better for us. So I think that probably at the Children's Aid Society, where I may be less focused on the discipline of innovation, because I know we know how to do that. I think where we have to continue to get better, and where we all have to continue to get better, presumably, is a discipline to create resources for innovation by being very thorough about what you're going to, the whole idea of prioritizing is saying that something is more important than something else. And we're all comfortable prioritizing on the top, but it's difficult once you get to the bottom. Forcing ourselves into disciplines where we say that if this is really more important than that, what does that mean in practice? Are we willing to do the hard decisions of operationalizing that? But treating it not as because we're retreating. I mean, the way to get people excited about it is to say, we're not doing that because we're retreating or we're sticking our hands in the sand. We're doing it because we want to make sure that we can continue to be the best, continue to create the best services for more people. And so I think that's the way we're looking at it at Children's Aid Society.
So we want to leave enough time for questions and answers. So I'm just going to have a quick wrap-up question. I'm hoping you can speak maybe 1 to 2 minutes to that. And then I think the process is that, did all of you get cards to write questions on? Or how are we? Okay, great. So I guess we'll start, you all can feel free to begin jotting down questions, and then while we are doing our wrap-up question. So just to step back, thinking about the broader sector, whatever we want to call it, nonprofit sector, social enterprise, what can we do collectively as a sector to capitalize on the opportunities today to affect change at a large scale? I know we've talked about human capital, we've talked about encouraging innovation. So I'd love to get you all's sort of thoughts on that, so your call to action for all of us who are part of this work. Janice, why don't we start with you?
I think two things come to mind. One is, and I think this came up earlier this morning, we don't have, as a sector, sort of a clear image of our own identity. What does it include and what doesn't it include? And if we don't, it's hard to imagine that other people do. So one thing, and there are many sort of convenings, associations of nonprofits in the city. What if we just sort of started at like the intramural level and sort of had the associations of nonprofits sort of get together to see if we could sort of, if you will, kind of brand ourselves and then be able to talk about ourselves to other people, because I think that probably is a first step. The other thing to think about, which may not be so popular, is that we sort of talk about how we can have, with limited resources for ourselves and for those who work for us, to provide continuing opportunities for professional development and growth when you're in a flat organization or don't have a lot of money. And one thing is that there's opportunities to grow if we sort of think of impact beyond the borders of our own individual 501c3s for staff to sort of move within the sector rather than sort of losing them to the sector. And there's, associations of different nonprofits in New York and elsewhere have sort of played with ideas of sort of having kind of, encouraging when staff sort of want to move up and there isn't something within the organization, or sort of lateral moves among staff. And there's a way that maybe we can, in lean times, provide chances for fulfillment and satisfaction. And, you can play with the notion, it can be a move from one job to another. It can be sort of a visiting, for, a day, a quarter, or something like that. But there's ways for us to sort of, and I think the 2 points sort of relate to each other, because it's for us to sort of get our own sort of nuanced feel for who we are and all sort of the wonderful variety of the sector. So when we sort of talk about it to ourselves and to others who are not in it, it has sort of the vibrancy and life of direct experience. So those would be two thoughts.
So I would, when the current sort of economic realities became clear to us about a year ago, there was all the talk in our sector about mergers and how organizations would come together and merge, and that would be an inevitable sort of more efficient and also sort of a winnowing out of the sector. And I'm very skeptical of that movement, if only for the fact that of all the entrenched stakeholders that are involved and what's involved and the loss that's involved with that kind of activity. And I think that's sort of borne out. I mean, you hear some stories of some organizations emerging, but and we'll see sort of what happens in the future. But in that idea, the idea that I think is more powerful and more realistic and more effective, I think, for the sector is the idea of networking and partnerships. I'm someone who really believes, and really we've embraced this in my organization, that the leadership skills that are really most important is networking, is the community. And it is through the community that we build and the relationships we have, and Rich has already talked about how those relationships, as part of his story of leadership, It's through those relationships that we learn about, we get access to people and ideas and resources, and that's how actually we solve problems and we create opportunities. And I think those partnership opportunities are where we as a sector have greatest potential. Again, speaking on what we talked about earlier, the current times have forced us at all to think really critically about what is core, about what is our impact. And then to provide services and to do good work, you can start, the more you think about what you're good at and what you're less good at, the more you can think about who do you need to find and work with to help achieve your impact. So an example from Coro is, we've honed our impact. To run a training program, you have to do a couple of things. You now have to provide the training and the staff and that expertise, but you also have to do the marketing and the recruitment and actually find the people who want to come through the program. And we have most of our resources invested in the training component of it. So when we think about growth, we don't say, okay, let's just start a new program. Let's think about partnerships and ideas of existing communities. So we had a conversation. I know that Young Nonprofit Professionals is one of the co-sponsors of this day. So we've started a conversation with them about, here's a community of people who are looking for leadership development programs. We've got a training expertise. What could we do together to create impact? And I think in those kinds of conversations is where the real opportunities are for our sector.
I agree with all of that. I will just add very briefly that for me, I will continue to think about people and the value of people. I feel so blessed to be able to do the work that I do. And in my career, I've been very intentional and very blessed about recruiting mentors who've offered me support and guidance throughout my career, and really encouragement in telling me that all the crazy things that I wanted to do, that it was okay and it was possible. So I think one thing that I do in my career, I try to do very intentionally, is to be there for people, not just inside my own organizations, but to be there for people who reach out to me, who have ideas, who are thinking about how they can progress in the field, because ultimately our ability to have an impact and to change the world fundamentally will depend on our ability to not only to get people to do the kind of work we do, but to encourage them to keep with it, to grow their skills, and to become leaders so that we can create the new innovation that will help make the world a better place tomorrow. So I think that one of the obligations that we all have is not just to look inside ourselves and our work, but to look in the field and to be a mentor, a supporter of all of those who are trying to do this work, and to keep them excited, to keep them engaged, and to let people know, particularly younger folks know, that this is a great way to spend your life.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you all for your, thanks. And thanks to all of you for your great questions. We're not going to be able to get through all of them because I have a whole pile here, but I think I'm going to prioritize by sort of frequency of the same types of questions. The first question, which Richard touched, well, all of you touched on a little bit, Richard touched on most recently just now, human capital, talent development, partly because I have a self-interest. I just really do believe that the talent pipeline is the main obstacle to future impact in our sector. A lot of questions around, how do I grow as a leader? What do you think a great leader is? How do I get prepared for, greater responsibility? So I'd love to get, I guess, maybe one or two of you, your reflections on, what's a true mark of a leader? What type of person, would you want to invest in as a funder and invest in as a CEO? And not just, what makes a good leader, what makes a standout leader?
I'll just, one point about that, I think it's helpful, one of the frameworks about leadership that we embrace at Coro is that leadership is not just for the CEOs and the executive directors of the organization. That leadership is actually an action, and leadership is something that's capable, that we all are capable of. And I think that concept, if you can embrace that in your organization and don't have an expectation that the leadership must come from the corner office or the top of the senior staff, but it actually is something that everyone is capable of, that's a very powerful concept. So to the point about the question, what can I do to be a leader? There's lots of things. There's lots of opportunities. I think in your wherever you are in the organization, to exercise leadership. So that's one point that I wanted to make. In terms of what can you do, I think that, certainly for all of us who have budget control over professional development dollars, I would make a case for not cutting those. That's a great investment to make, and particularly at this time, a small amount of professional development dollars to go to a conference or an event or a training is not a huge investment to make in people that both builds their skill set and also is an expression of value to them in the company, in your organization. But I also think there's lots of opportunities to exercise leadership wherever you are in an organization. And again, if you embrace the idea that leadership is an action, and leadership is, we're all capable of practicing leadership, I think if you think about, things that aren't getting done in the organization, where are there opportunities to step up where no one's doing something? I mean, we've gotten great leadership from younger people in our organization because their boss's position was eliminated. And so there's just work that's not being done, and they've stepped up and embraced that opportunity and seized that and delivered great results in addition to sort of building their own leadership capacity.
Yeah. And there was a question about the current team, on our staff, I guess from a manager leader's perspective. How do we continue, and Janice, I think you touched on this, to engage and inspire our staff during these tough times?
Yes, I mean, I do think some kind of, exchange or job visiting is one way to do it. Another way is, to sort of send a message that, to go back to some of our earlier conversation, that sort of innovation is everybody's business. We do this at our organization, but I've seen it in service delivery organizations as well, where, there is clearly a forum where particularly mid-level and junior staff can sort of pitch new ideas that sort of get, discussed and vetted, and you are rewarded with a little bit of extra time on the job, not doing your regular job, but sort of exploring or sort of searching your idea. And you can sort of make that, we've actually just this year sort of tried to have written that into sort of people's job descriptions, that's something that we look for, expect, and support in trying to sort of think about things, to your point, Scott, about things that are sort of beyond the boundaries of one's current job, about what's next ahead for the organization, what are we missing, what caught us by surprise, what should we as a larger community be thinking about, and to sort of support that and acknowledge it by, for some that sort of pass some vetting, some amount of time to sort of look into them. And that's another way to sort of, I think, support that.
I think
a lot of people.
Just like the cliche to say that, you can't be a leader if you don't have any followers. So, I think one of the essential habits here about being a leader, for me, it's about creating teams and leading teams. And I think there are a few things that for me are important. I try to I want to always create an atmosphere where it's okay to have tension, it's okay to have disagreement, it's okay to argue, as long as it's honest disagreement and argument about plans and issues. Never to go in and create an environment where I say one thing and the expectation is that no one's going to challenge me, or being defensive if people push back. You want to create an environment where you can have a robust debate about the best way to do things. I try to always just repeat what my priorities are, and every time there's a question, every time there's an idea, to try to push people to test it against what we said we're trying to accomplish. So I think a lot of that is just about habits, about self-confidence, about being open to being challenged, but then also, once you make a decision, to be clear about what's open for debate and what is actually decided and what's the path moving forward.
So, not surprising, a lot of questions about fundraising, particularly in this context. Janice, that one might have to be volleyed to you initially. Question being, what should we be doing in terms of fundraising? Should we hold off before going to talk to investors and just focus on building the relationship? One person asked, how do we get by during this time? Are there opportunities? Are there different ways that we should be approaching funders? And Janice, again, if you could start, maybe if we have time for Scott or Richard to weigh in from the fundraiser perspective.
Sure. I mean, I think, Vic, didn't you say earlier, like, you've met a funder? So I do think there's something about, even if you don't have a specific ask, or you need to sort of like size them up, get where their head's at, talk with them, ask to sort of have a conversation where you're not going to pitch them, because then they get, they chill out a little bit, so they relax, and, then you can sort of learn more and you can come back to them. If you're working in an area that is covered, which I assume many of us are, by public systems of service delivery, see if the agency heads, for example, have advisory boards or comment sessions to sort of find out what's coming ahead there. As many of us have discussed, I think I mentioned earlier, the stimulus money, if you're in social services, there's things that are changing here, certainly in the city, to sort of find out what you might sort of get in on that maybe didn't even exist before. I think for the private philanthropy, to some extent, the dust has settled. So I think it's gone from sort of like freeze and, I don't know what you think, Vic, freeze and sort of freak out to where you can actually sort of have a conversation with people about what they're planning ahead. So I would encourage that. I think I wouldn't sort of think of it as just sort of one meeting where you sort of either sort of make the pitch or not. They're right? These are all sort of relationships. And so I realize it's, it takes an amount of time and you're busy running your organization, but those are some of the things that I would do.
Do you want to weigh in? Scott?
I would just reiterate the importance and the value of having a long-term vision, because it's my conversations with funders, I think, have gone much better when I'm able to talk about where Coro is going, again, not just how we're going to get through the next 6 months, but where we're going to be for the next 6 years. And I think that funders, who are thinking much more critically about their resources, want to make investments that pay off for the long haul. And Janice's points are right about being able to talk about impact, and of course you want to be able to do that well. But I also think that that people want to know that they're making investments in organizations that that have a plan, are going to be around. The one thing I'll say about fundraising is that it's also I've actually found it to be a very energizing activity, in the sense that one of the challenges this time, like we talked about, is sort of staying connected with your vision and the mission that drives all of our work. When you're fundraising, that's what you're talking about. When you're fundraising, you're talking about why your organization's important. You're talking about why your work is unique and special, and the impact. You're talking about it with someone who's generally, presumably, interested in about it. It's challenging to do, obviously, in this environment. But it's also it's also connects. I find it something that connects you with why I do what I do.
Great. And we're going to close on one time now. Should we close now? Okay. Well, I guess we don't have our last question. It's a great question about what will the sector look like in the next 10 years. I want to thank all of you, and can we give another round of applause to our wonderful panel? I just want to leave with one comment, which is, one thing that I learned pretty early on, learning from an amazing leader, Wendy Cobb, the founder of Teach for America, during my first work outside of college, was, the true mark of a leader is somebody who moves from thinking about seeking their own success to thinking about how they can contribute. And I think that framework is so helpful, especially during tough times, like constantly really thinking not so much about us, but thinking about how can we, contribute more broadly. So if any of you we didn't get to all the questions, I certainly am happy to try to answer any of them. I'll leave my email with Claire and Luana if any of you want to contact me. And I want to thank you all again.